What is up, guys? I'm your friendly neighborhood web war fanatic, and we are here with two new card reviews from the upcoming Agents of Shoot expansion for Marvel Champions. Thank you so much to Fantasy Flight Games for sending me these cards to review for the community, and I want to give a huge shout out to everyone who watches these videos, who likes, comments, all that stuff. It's thanks to you guys that Fantasy Flight Games knows this channel and sent me cards, so I appreciate you guys a lot. The two cards that Fantasy Flight Games sent me is this Justice Helicarrier right here and this Aggression Helicarrier right here. And I noticed that we have a bunch of Helicarriers now in the game. So we have the Justice one, that's 6 cost, the Aggression one, the Circe, which is the Leadership one, and the Protection one. And we have a bunch of other ones as well in Maria Hill's Identity Specific Kit and before Maria Hill came out. So I thought it would be fun to rank all the Helicarriers in the game for true solo and in multiplayer, because I do think a lot of these newer Helicarriers are a lot better in multiplayer. Okay, so before we jump into that, I do want to give a little bit of a backstory to how these helicarriers work. So if you guys have not seen, Maria Hill is one of the two new heroes that's coming out in the Agents of Shield expansion, and she has an ability where you can include shield supports from different aspects in her kit whenever you're deck building for her. So she can have a leadership support that has a shield trait, a protection one, a justice one, and an aggression one in her deck. And she also comes with a bunch of 6 cost shield supports, very expensive, in her pre-con deck. We've already seen all these cards from the preview article. So the cards that they sent me were the Justice support right here. So it's called the Douglas. It is a 6 cost support. It comes in play with 3 operation counters. Then as an action, you can exhaust this card, remove 1 operation counter from it, and then remove 2 threat from every single scheme, ignoring any crisis icons in play. So this is a really cool and unique card because there's not that many ways in aspect cards to remove threat from the main scheme, ignoring crisis icons. I do want to make a note that it does come in with 3 operation counters, comparing that to the leadership and the protection one that only come in with 2 counters for each, but Maria Hill's identity specific one also comes in with 3. So this does have the 3 counters on it. Then being able to remove 2 threat from each scheme in play, I think is good if there's a lot of schemes. If there's not that many schemes, it's not going to be as good. So I see this card as a lot better in multiplayer, because if there's, for example, 4 schemes out, then a Douglas can remove 8 threat total, 2 from each one of those 4 schemes. Versus if you're playing solo and there's only like 1 side scheme in the main scheme, this will only remove 4 threat, 2 from each scheme, which isn't as high value. The biggest advantage of this card, in my opinion, is being able to bypass those crisis icons, but there are a lot of main schemes that say that, for example, threat cannot be removed from this scheme while another condition is met. So like, for example, for Ronin's main scheme stage 2B, if he has the power stone, you cannot remove threat from that scheme. So even though the Douglas here can bypass crisis icons, it will not be able to bypass stuff like that, unfortunately. So it's not like a universal remove threat from the main scheme. It will only bypass the crisis icons, and it will also bypass patrol, because this is not a thwart activation. So even if you have a patrol minion, you can still remove threat from the main scheme, bypassing that. I don't really know too much about the comic book lore for these shield helicarriers, but I did do a little bit of research and I found out that the Douglas here is actually a AIM helicarrier. So I think it's one for the bad guys. I'm not entirely sure. You guys let me know down in the comments if I'm right on that. Next, let's move on to the second card that Fantasy Flight Games sent me, which is the Aggression Helicarrier called the Bellerophon. I apologize if I pronounce that incorrectly. You guys, please let me know down in the comments if I'm saying that right or wrong. So this is another 6 cost support for aggression. It also has that shield trait, also coming in with 3 counters instead of just 2, like the leadership and the protection ones. And as an action for this card, you can exhaust it, remove a counter from it, and then choose a player. Deals 3 damage to the villain in each minute engaged with that player, discarding all tough stats cards from those enemies first. So this card I like a little bit more than the Justice one, because it is a on-demand damage that will bypass tough and discard them as well. This card is very reminiscent to a lot of identity specific hero events that heroes have. So for example, Iceman has this identity specific card called the Ice Blast, where you choose a player, deals 3 damage to a villain in each minute engaged with that player. Nick Fury has one where he has a bunch of guns. It's one of the new spoiler cards for Nick Fury, where he can blast the villain and each minion engage with a certain player and dealing 3 damage to each one of those minions. So this card is similar to those events, except it is on demand because you're playing the support, and it's double the cost, because normally those events are a 3 cost card, 3 cost event, and this is a 6 cost support. So for me, comparing the value of this card compared to those other cards are that I think that those cards like the Ice Blast are very, very good if I can play them whenever I really need it and defeat a bunch of minions with it. Unfortunately, I usually get swarm minions whenever I don't have the card in my hand, or have the card in my hand and I don't have a bunch of minions in play. So I think having it be a support is actually really good. And if you get, 2, 3 uses out of it because it's on demand, you can just wait for whenever you are swarmed with minions and then exhaust this card, do 3 damage to all those minions, and knock off their tufts as well, right? Because the other identity-specific events do not pierce or knock off tufts. Overall, I can see this card being very good with minion heavy strategies and aggression, like with Bring It. You get a bunch of minions, play Bring It, draw a bunch of cards, and you can play the Bellerophon and bust up all those minions doing 3 damage to each one of them, and that could be a very powerful combo with this card. For the lore of the Bellerophon, or where it comes from, apparently this was the Helicarrier that was used by John Garrett. If you guys watch the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., John Garrett is the mentor of Grant Ward. So I'm not going to really spoil anything else about that, but that's pretty interesting that this is the Helicarrier for him. And I'm not sure if in the comics he's the exact same guy as he is in the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. TV show. But yeah, that's his Helicarrier right here. I do think that these 6-cost shoot supports are a lot better with Maria Hill because she has a massive economy and she can include them without choosing that aspect to play in, right? So even if she's playing in like leadership, she can still have the aggression one and the justice one and protection one in her deck, which will give her more versatility. But the way that I'm going to be evaluating these cards is as if you're playing a different hero and if you want to include these cards in your deck whenever building for a hero. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the first tier list. Alright guys, I'm excited to do some Helicarrier ranking right here. So I have the 7 Helicarriers in the game of Marvel Champions, and this will be my ranking for how strong they are in true solo. In my opinion, this is entirely subjective, just my opinion on how I play this game. And after this list, I'm going to do the exact same list for multiplayer, because I do think these 6-cost Helicarriers are a lot better in multiplayer. The first of the 5 tiers that I have right here is going to be the S tier. These are auto includes whenever you're deck building. I think that they're super duper good cards. I'm always prioritizing them whenever I draw them. I don't want to pitch these cards as resources. I always want to play them down because they're just really good. The A tier are cards that I think are also really good, but I wouldn't mind pitching them as a resource if I have to, but I still want to prioritize them and I want to play them whenever possible. If they're in play, they're definitely going to have massive value every single turn. B tier are cards that I think are more situational. I think that I wouldn't mind pitching them as a resource if I need to, but still overall a very solid card. C tier are cards that I think that in order to maximize their full value, you really have to deck build around this card. I think if you're just building a deck and you just randomly include this card, they usually won't be good. But if you plan the deck around this card, then you can really maximize the full value of it. So C tier are situation cards that you really need to build around and focus around in order to make them good. And then D tier are cards that I don't think are very good at all. Hopefully there are no Helicarriers here that I would think is a D tier card, but we will see. Okay, so this one will be for true solo. So first we have the OG Helicarrier that came out in the core box. It's a 3-cost support, location shield, has max 1 per player. As an action, you can exhaust this card. Choose any player, reduce the resource cost of the next card that player plays this phase by 1. I think that the Helicarrier is a super good card. We're going to put it up here in the A tier. It's definitely really solid. It's always going to be useful if you have it in play. Having that cost reduction is really, really good. It's pretty much a pseudo resource generator, something that I like to use to call cards that aren't a straight up resource generator. It's a really solid card. Next, we will be taking a look at the Helicarrier right here, which is another 3-cost support. It has the Avenger and the Vehicle trait. Play only if your identity has the Avenger's trait. And this is a resource generator. You can exhaust this to generate a wild resource. So the Helicarrier, in my opinion, is better than the Helicarrier in true solo. I'm going to put it up here in the A tier. Still not an S tier level card. It's just a really solid resource generator, but not as good as most identity-specific resource generators. So the reason why I think the Helicarrier is better than the Helicarrier is because this is a list for true solo. And I think for true solo, there are more perks to having a wild resource than for the Helicarrier here, right? So if the villain gets a nasty attachment and you need to spend resources for a hero action, the Helicarrier does not generate resources for you, so you can't use that for that. But if you have the Helicarrier, you can always generate a wild resource to do that. If your hero has any sort of ability where you need a resource, like a specific physical resource, mental resource, etc., then Helicarrier can generate a resource for that. Helicarrier can't do that. Helicarrier does have a unique trait, so they're not allowed other Helicarriers in play. But in true solo, that doesn't matter because the Helicarrier has a max 1 per player anyways. So if you're playing in solo, you cannot have multiple Helicarriers in play either. The only difference is that if you're building a deck with the Helicarriers, you can have 3 of them in your deck, but only 1 in play at a time. For the Helicarrier, you can only put 1 in your deck because of that unique rule right there. This is only going to be for true solo, which is why I think the Queen Carrier is better in that player count setting. Next, let's take a look at the next support, which is the Iliad, which is Maria Hill's identity-specific support. 6 cost support, so way more expensive than the other ones that we just looked at with the Helicarrier and Queen Carrier. Comes with 3 counters, and we already know what it does. You can choose either do 5 damage, remove 4 threat, or heal 3 damage from any identity, not from an ally. So Iliad, man, where would I rank this card? I think it's definitely no lower than B tier. The problem with it is that it's just so expensive. Man, being 6 costs, I don't think I can put it on a level of the A tier. So for B tier cards, I think are a little bit more situational, and A tier cards are pretty much just good all the time. And you know what? No, I think the Iliad, I just convinced myself by saying that because the Iliad, it's not very situational. It's pretty much always going to be useful, right? Because you can either do 5 damage, you can remove 4 threat, or heal 3 damage from an identity. If you can play this card, it's definitely going to be really good. And it does have 3 mission counters, so you can get a lot of use out of it. For Maria Hill specifically, because this is her identity-specific card, she can actually move counters all around, these all-purpose counters. So if you have like a weaker support, like let's say attack team, you can actually move a counter from attack team over to the Iliad and give the Iliad more counters, which is more value because it's 6 cost and has a better effect than attack team. For example, where it can do 5 damage instead of just 2 for one of the all-purpose counters. So overall, I think it's an A tier level card. It's not as good as Helicarrier and Queen Carrier in my opinion, but it definitely works in True Soul as well. I think the only reason it's not as good is because it's so expensive, but if you are playing Maria Hill, which you have to be to use this card, and get offer stuff going on, then you can move a bunch of counters over to Iliad, ready it back up with her effects. But since you have to be playing Maria Hill in order to use this card, you have her abilities to move counters from other cards over to Iliad. You can ready it up with her different identity specific events, and yeah, you can get a lot more value from it because it works for Maria Hill, being able to do 5 damage, ready back up, do another 5 damage, put a counter on it, ready back up, do another 5 damage. I mean, that is really good to have this on demand. The biggest thing with these supports is that they are on demand, so you can trigger them anytime. You don't have to wait to draw into them like an event. All right, so the next card that we're going to be taking a look at is the Pericles, which is a 6 cost protection support. And a quick side note for the Pericles, from my research, I found out that this is actually the Helicarrier that Agent Coulson and his team was on. So a huge shout out to anyone that watches the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. That show is awesome, and I guess this is their Helicarrier from the comics. Okay, so this is the protection one. It has 2 supply counters, so a little bit less than the Iliad. As an action, exhausted, remove a counter, give a hero or villain a stats card of your choice, and then give an ally or minion a stats card of your choice. So this card right here is, I think it's really solid, but just very expensive is going to be the biggest problem with these supports here. Because being able to, if you are facing a villain that is not stalwart, or if they're not steady as well, it's going to be a lot better because you can just always give a confuse or a stun on the villain, and then you can give your ally toughness or give a minion a stun or confuse as well. And if you are facing a stalwart enemy, this card is still really good because you can always give your hero a tough status card. So being able to have that versatility to either stun or confuse the villain, but if the villain is stalwart, you can give yourself a tough status card, is massive value. And even if you don't have any minions in play to give them a stats card, you can always give an ally a tough stats card as well. So you can always control it, right, by giving your identity a tough stats card and by giving your ally a tough stats card if you don't want to give the stats to the enemy. So super duper versatile card here. In terms of the ranking for this card, I think I would put it actually in the A tier. And I think I would actually put it above the Iliad. I don't think it's as good as the Helicarrier and the Queen Carrier because they are so cheap to play just being a 3 cost card. 3 isn't even cheap, but compared to 6, it's really cheap. But the Pericles, I think it's worth spending your whole entire hand to get this card down, even though it only has 2 counters. Because what it does is it mitigates the villain's phase, right? By giving them a stats card or giving yourself a tough stats card, you can pretty much mitigate the activation of the villain, whether they attack or scheme, right? Because you want to give them a confuse if you're going to be flipping down to alter ego, and you can nullify a minion as well or buff up your ally. Then for the next coming turn, whenever the Pericles rises back up again, you can use it again, remove another counter, and then once again choose the stats cards that you want to give on either yourself or the villain. So it pretty much protects you for 2 turns. And I think that it is worth your entire hand to protect you for a turn and an additional turn after that. So I can definitely see the case of this card, being a little bit too expensive and being a little bit too defensive. But I think that value to be able to protect you is really good versus the Iliad. Although you spend your whole entire hand to play this card, maybe it can do, 4 threat removal from a scheme, but the villain's still going to activate against you, and now you're kind of defenseless if you didn't play an ally or do something else. But the Pericles can give you a tough or stun the villain. So I think it's a little bit more valuable to have that versus the Iliad for that cost. Even though Iliad does have an additional counter, 3 counters instead of just 2 like the Pericles. All right, next we have the Circe. So this is a 6 cost support, shield again. This is though another one that was reviewed in Maria Hill's preview article. Comes in with 2 counters as an action exhausted card. Remove 1 counter from it and then choose a player. That player puts any ally into play from their hand. So this card here, I don't think it is as good as the other Helicarrier supports. I'm gonna put it here in the B tier. And if these Helicarrier supports were like cheaper, they're like, 4 costs, 3 costs, they're definitely go, way up. Probably be like an S tier level card, but being so expensive really hurts because you have to spend a whole entire turn to play this. And what is that impact for you on that first turn? Maria Hill gets way more value from these cards because she can move counters on them in future turns and get more uses. But for most people, or most heroes, I mean, they'll only get the amount of uses that come on the card. So 2 uses from the Circe and 2 uses from the Pericles here. So yeah, the Circe, I think is really good, but unfortunately, you need to have the ally in your hand. So you need to be able to pay 6 to play this card and also have that ally in your hand if you want that immediate board impact. Otherwise, you're spending 6 resources to just play this card and you're doing nothing else that turn. So that's the complete opposite of the Pericles, where it can immediately give you a tough or stun or confuse a villain, and it can immediately impact the board and protect you for a turn. Versus the Circe, it's immediately going to do nothing unless you have an ally in your hand, but it's going to be really difficult to also have an ally and be able to play a 6-cost Helicarrier. So I think that for that reason, it's not going to be as good. But the Circe probably has the biggest potential, in my opinion, right? Because if you're able to get a bunch of counters on this card, you can exhaust it and play free allies every single turn over and over again, which could be insanely powerful. So over the long course of the game, I can definitely see this having more value than the Pericles or the Iliad. But I have to evaluate the cost for what it is, and I don't think it's as good as these guys. I think it is a little bit more situational, even though the overall impact could be greater if you already have the Circe in play. All right, so next we're going to be evaluating the 2 new cards that I got to review here. So the Douglas is the Justice card. 6 costs, really expensive. It does have the 3 counters instead of just 2, so I think it gets a little bit more use. But removing 2 threat from every single scheme, I just don't think that 2 is enough threat removal to justify 6 costs, especially in True Soul. I think in multiplayer this card's a lot better, but for True Soul, I'm going to have to put this here in the C tier. I don't think it is a trash card because an on-demand threat removal I think is always good. You guys know I love B Cops, right? I think B Cop is a top level card. And this card right here, the Douglas, you can kind of argue it's similar to a B Cop. It's in between the temple of what a B Cop would be because B Cop removes 1 threat from a scheme, but it stays in play forever. The Douglas can remove 2 from every single scheme. So that's the reason why I don't have this card in the trash tier, because I think it is valuable to have something that's on demand so that if you have threat remove in your hand, you can still remove threat and save the Douglas for the future for whenever a bunch of side schemes come out, and then you can exhaust the Douglas and do that massive threat removal. And I wish that the effect here wasn't just ignoring crisis icons in play, but that you could actually remove 2 threat from the main scheme no matter what, ignoring any other effect. I think that would be really cool and really thematic with the Douglas here, right? So like I talked about before with Ronin's main scheme stage 2B, if Ronin has a Power Stone, it says that you cannot remove threat from that scheme. If the Douglas says ignore any other card in play, you're going to remove the 2 threat from the main scheme no matter what. I think that would be pretty cool, and that would definitely bump it up maybe to the B tier, just to have that niche ability to remove threat no matter what, because there is no other card in the game that can do that. But overall, I can relate this card to the B Cop, and I think that even with that, I think the B Cop is a better card because B Cop can stay in play forever. But yeah, I can definitely see the burst potential for Douglas being really good if there are a bunch of side schemes in play, or you really need to ignore that crisis, but you can't remove threat from that side scheme that has a crisis, so you're able to just bypass that and get some threat removal so that you don't lose for that turn. So it can be a good card, but I think it's a little bit more situation. I think that you definitely need to build around it. C tier is a tier for cards that I think that the player needs to really build around and focus their deck around versus just being a solid like situational card like the B tier level cards. All right, and the last Helicarrier that we're going to be looking at is the Bellerophon. So 6 cost aggression support with the shield trait as an action, and this also has the 3 counters. As an action, exhaust this card, remove 1 missile counter from it, and then choose a player. Do 3 damage to the villain. and each minion engages with that player, it is discarding all the tough stats cards. I think that this is a pretty cool effect, and if I'm comparing it to the Ice Blast, I think it definitely goes at least in the B tier because it's better than those events because I know how good those events are because if I'm able to get them off, it was really satisfying, but I don't want to hold on to that event card in my hand. And this card, if you can just play down, you can just wait for whenever the minions swarm. And I like that it's an aggression as well, so you can play Bring It. You can really just build out minions, bring them all out with like looking for trouble. Play the Bring It, draw a bunch of cards, and then trigger the Bellerophon and just defeat all those minions in play with that on-demand ability to like do AoE damage, also ignoring tough stats cards as well. So this card right here, ooh, where would I put it? Do I think it's better than the Cersei? Um, that is really hard to say. I think I'm gonna put it behind the Cersei. I don't think it's as good as the leadership card. It's more high value immediately, but no, you know what? No, it is better than Cersei because I think I'm evaluating the Cersei too much for Maria Hill. I think for Maria Hill, I would rate the Cersei as a better card just because she can move counters over to it. But for every other hero in the game, the Bellerophon comes in with 3 counters. The Cersei only comes in with 2, and then having that on-demand piercing ability, AoE minion killing ability, I think it's really good. And yeah, I think that it's situational, but if you get this card in play, you can just hold it there, and that mitigates a lot of the situationalness of the card. It's just really when do you have a chance to play a 6-cost support? Yeah, that's gonna be the biggest situation for it. But if you have a bunch of 3 hit point or lower minions, that is a really good time to waste your entire turn to play the Bellerophon because it can delete all those minions. So I could see having that immediate impact like the Pericles here as well. But the turn you play it, you ideally want to be defeating a bunch of minions with it anyways. But if you have a free turn and you want to just play that, also help out for the future. So overall, I think it's still a solid card. And I think for most here, it's going to be better than the Cersei. Maria Hill, I think the Cersei is going to have a higher potential. So yeah, this is my list here for true solo. I think this is pretty fair. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you guys agree with this list for playing in true solo. If you evaluate these cards in this order, I definitely think that the Helicarrier and Helicarrier are still the best. Helicarrier being able to generate that resource, Helicarrier, just being able to give you that cost reduction and only being 3 costs compared to all these other 6 cost ones right here. They can immediately do something. It's a lot better than if they can't, right? The Douglas can immediately remove threats, but only 2 threat off the main scheme. I don't think that that's enough to waste your entire turn to play this card down for, and then you are left undefended during the villain phase, similar to the Cersei, right? So I think that if you can immediately do something, it's going to be a lot better. So this would be the order that I rank these cards. Let's jump over to the multiplayer rankings for all the Helicarriers. Okay, so this will be my tier ranking for all the Helicarriers in the game for multiplayer specifically. So specifically at higher player counts, not for true solo. And I think that the Helicarrier becomes a much better card. It's still gonna be an A tier level card. A resource generator, I think is really good. It's still not like the biggest, most impactful card in the game, but I do think that the Helicarrier is better in multiplayer because you can reduce the resource cost of the next card that a player plays this phase by 1. So you don't have to choose yourself. You can give the Helicarrier to someone else, and it's an action. So you use this card out of turn if someone requests an action from you, right? So if I'm playing with somebody and then they're playing cards during their turn and they're like, hey, can you exhaust your Helicarrier for me to use? I can do that during my turn, and then they can play a card from their hand, reducing its cost by 1. So definitely a very good card. I think it definitely goes up in multiplayer, but still going to stay here in the A tier. Next, we have the Helicarrier. I think the Helicarrier is still going to be an A tier level card for multiplayer as well, but I'm going to now put it behind the Helicarrier because I think that at higher player counts, the Helicarrier is much better than Helicarrier because the Helicarrier has a unique symbol there, which means that if I have the Helicarrier in my deck and you have it in your deck, whoever plays it down, the other person cannot play it, right? So unlike the Helicarrier, which is max 1 per player, but we can all have Helicarriers on the table and help each other out, the Helicarrier is only for yourself. It's much more of a greedy card, and it hurts everyone else if they have Helicarriers because they can't use their own Helicarrier. So the resource generator is still better than the Helicarrier, but it's restricted to only yourself. You cannot generate a wild resource for any other player if you're the one that controls the Helicarrier. So not as good in my opinion as the Helicarrier for multiplayer, but still overall a solid card just to help you generate resources for yourself. Next, we have the Iliad again. So this is Maria Hill's identity-specific support. You can exhaust it to either do 5 damage, remove 4 threat, or heal 3 damage from an identity. This card in multiplayer, I think it definitely goes up. Is it going to be still in the A tier behind these cards? I think actually, I would put the Iliad actually above the Helicarrier because I think that it's so viable to have this action that you can call on out of turn, and it's always going to be able to be useful because dealing 5 damage, removing 4 threat, and healing 3 damage from an identity. And the biggest reason why this card jumps up above the Queen Carrier for me in multiplayer is that it's a 6 cost support, which is its biggest downfall. But in multiplayer, you will have the breathing room to waste a turn to play this card because the other players that you're playing with, the other players at the table, can hopefully cover the slack for you for 1 turn, and the next turn you can help them out with this Iliad card right here, right? So in multiplayer, you just have more breathing room in general because there's more people picking up the slack for you. So if I'm playing Maria Hill in multiplayer and I want to waste my whole entire turn to play this card, I can ask my friend, hey, can you play an extra ally to block for me during the villain phase, because I'm going to waste my whole turn playing the Iliad, but next turn I can do stuff on my own and I'll be able to use the Iliad again to either do 5 damage, remove more threat, or heal 3 damage from you. Having 6 cost cards, even though they have very powerful effects, are not as good in solo because you need that breathing room in order to play this card down. But in multiplayer, you have a lot more breathing room, so usually you'll be able to play the card a lot easier, even if you can't deal with the board state that turn that you play this card. So for that reason, I think it's going to be better than Queen Carrier because it's more helpful in multiplayer. And yeah, it's going to still be here in the A tier. Next, we're going to take a look at the Pericles, the protection support here. I think that this card actually drops down a little bit in multiplayer because its ability to give a status card. I think that status cards are not as good in multiplayer because the villain activation phase, they're usually either just attack once or scheme once. But if you're in multiplayer, you need more status cards on the villain to prevent more activations, and they only have 1 stun at the end of the day and 1 confuse. So if you're playing in 4 players and you stun and confuse a villain, 2 activation will be canceled, but those still activate 2 more times, so you're not getting as much value blocking out the entire activation phase compared to in solo. And the tough stats cards, the exact same thing. I think for the toughs, you want to distribute them more evenly, but you can only give 1 ally a tough stats card or only give 1 hero a tough stats card as well. So Pericles, I think, is definitely not going to be as good in multiplayer. Is it still going to be in the A tier for me, or am I going to drop it down to the B tier? I think I'm actually going to drop it down to the B tier here. It's still a solid card, but only coming with the 2 counters, and it has the immediate presence to be able to mitigate, some of the activations or give yourself a tough stats card, but you're not going to get as much value out of it because the villain is still going to activate to the other player unless the other player can also, stun or confuse. And for the next turn, it's going to be the exact same thing. So although it's 6 costs, which requires a lot of breathing room in order to play, and although its effect can give you a little bit more breathing room because it can stop an activation, it cannot fully stop the activation phase in multiplayer like it can in true solo. And the player in general will probably just have more breathing room to play 6 cost cards anyways. So that extra breathing room from the Pericles isn't as necessary in multiplayer. So I will put it here in the B tier. I don't think it's as good as these other cards. All right, next we're going to take a look at the Cersei here. So this is the one where you can exhaust, remove a counter, and choose a player. That player can put an ally into play from their hand. All right, that is pretty cool because in multiplayer, if you have this card down, out of turn, you can use your action and you can give anyone on the table a free ally, not just yourself. So this card definitely moves up for me in multiplayer, and it's still going to be at least B tier. And I think that for multiplayer, this card will now be better than the Pericles, being able to give out free allies to other players. It only has 2 deploy counters though, so you really need to be playing expensive allies to get the full value out of this card. If you are doing Maria Hill and you can move counters to it, it's a lot better. But for non-Maria Hill people, I think it's still going to be a little bit on the expensive side and requires a little bit more of a situational use, I think. So the thing is, for the allies, most allies that are really good are going to be 3 cost max. There are some good 4 cost allies as well, but you need to draw into them, or the other players at the table also need to draw into them to use the effect of the Cersei to give them that free ally. So for most players, you're only going to be able to play 2 allies for free with the Cersei. So it just kind of depends. Do you want to waste your own turn to not be able to play anything, to give your friends an extra ally that turn and for a future turn? Or do you want to just do something yourself? Maybe you can play your own ally instead of paying 6 costs for his card, and then your friend can just pay for their ally, and then same thing for the next turn, right? So it just kind of depends if it's worth wasting your turn to pay 6 costs for future allies or for someone to play ally that turn. And I do want to note that although it is an action, you cannot play the Cersei out of turn, right? So you have to play Cersei during your turn. So for example, if you're playing a 2-player game and your friend goes first and they have an ally in their hand and they pass their turn, so now it's your turn, and you play the Cersei, yes, you can use the action and remove a counter from it and choose a player so you can have your friend play an ally for free. but that ally can no longer activate because the basic activation can only happen during a player's turn. So since they already passed to you, they can no longer do that. And you could not have played a Cersei during their turn because you can't play supports out of hand, because in Marvel Champions, we aren't allowed to play supports out of turn because they are in action themselves, right? Even though it does have that action word on the card, it's not an action in itself to play the card. So you have to actually play that during your own turn. So I can definitely see the sequence in there being a little bit restrictive at times. All right, next let's take a look at the cards that Fantasy Flight Games sent me. So the Douglas is the Justice support, where you can exhaust it, remove a counter, and remove 2 threat from every single scheme in play, ignoring the cross icons. So this card, I think, is going to go up to the B tier for me in multiplayer. Is it as good as the Pericles or the Cersei? So let's see. Being able to remove 2 threat from every single scheme, there are just going to be more schemes in general. You can play side schemes and then trigger the Douglas to remove threat from the side schemes as well, which can be really good. Overall, I do think that the Douglas is better in multiplayer, but I still don't think it's as good as the other Helicarriers that are currently in the game. All right. Lastly, we have the aggression one, the Bellerophon, and I think that this card actually is a lot better in multiplayer. I'm going to move it all the way up here to the A tier, and I'm going to put it, I think, I'm going to put it behind the Quinn carry here. Um, no, I think it's going to be a little bit better than Quinn carry because it will have a lot more use. So this thing is really good because there's going to be a lot more minions in multiplayer. One really cool thing about this card is that it's on demand. I think that on demand ability from an aggression card that can do damage and ping off toughs is really valuable, especially because it's not a hero action, it's just any action. So you use it as an alter ego. So if, for example, the villain has a tough and you need to ping it off, having this card in play can always remove those toughs and do 3 damage. If the enemy has minions or toughness on those minions, one thing that I always have problems with playing at higher player counts is the sequencing of who removes the tough, who has piercing, what we're going to do. The Bellerophon makes everything easier and makes all the damage calculations work out perfectly, especially with the sequencing, right? So if you just have this card in play, it doesn't matter if you go first or if another player goes first. You can exhaust it, remove a missile counter from it, and then choose a player, do 3 damage, and remove the toughs from every enemy that is engaged with that player. Then everyone else can follow through and do whatever sequencing that they need to do. But having that ability to ping off the tough is going to be the biggest value from this card, in addition to its versatility to be able to do tons of damage in multiplayer in alter ego, right? So that's what really helps with sequencing, because I find most of the time if I want to perform a hero action and I request it, the other player might be an alter ego and they can't do it even though they have the card in their hand. So that just really helps out round everything in multiplayer out and allow the team to work together more fluidly, especially when you're going for that final push, but also whenever you want to deal with minions and just control the board. So I do think that the Bellerophon is really good because of that on-demand ability. It's very versatile in multiplayer. There will be more enemies, will be more minions, so you get a lot more use out of it. And then that is definitely a card that you want to get in play for that final push, but also just to have down in general, because if it's down and you get minions out, you can always defeat those minions quite easily with this on-demand support, on-demand action right here. So there you guys have it. This is my tier ranking for the Helicarriers in multiplayer, and the list is actually quite different than how it was in True Solo. That just kind of shows how different the game is at True Solo and at different player counts. Let me know what you guys think. Did you agree or disagree with these two lists? This is entirely subjective. It's just my opinion. So definitely let me know how I'm wrong or how I'm right if you agree with me. I hope you guys all enjoyed this video and enjoy these card reviews. Thank you so much once again to Fantasy Flight Games for these cards, and I'll see you guys all in the next one.